Hello class, my name is Shane. I am a Liberty University student pursuing a master's in military operations, and today we're going to be doing a case analysis of the battle or defense of Jisr al-Doreaa, Dream 6, and I'm going to be utilizing a starburst analysis to go through the critical information requirements as we kind of allude to some of the things that are the big ticket and key items of this case. So general situation, the bottom line up front is that this is a defense of a local village that is concerned with counterinsurgency operations to weed out enemy and win the local populace over. A humanitarian or block 1 and 2 style approach is basically what the troops are focused with going into this environment, and the main focus being on the locals and building up that village, building up the clinics for medical, and building up a local police force that was once previously non-existent. So the U.S. government in 2009, their Guide to Counterinsurgency, defines counterinsurgency as the counterinsurgency is a comprehensive civilian and military efforts taken to simultaneously defeat and contain insurgency and address its root causes. So essentially, IDing that there are threats. Some of the threats may be ambiguous in nature. Some of the threats may be embedded in the local populace, like we've seen in Vietnam, historically, Iraq, and Afghanistan, wearing traditional dress of the public, and it's very hard to decipher between who is who at any moment's notice. So they might go in there with a Block 1 humanitarian mentality, but at the end of the day, they have that Block 2 counterinsurgency mission up front, where things can go from public-oriented, focused on the locals, to the enemy rather quickly. So the bottom line up front for the general rundown of the situation, going through like a time lapse of the events. The first thing, as they're going and having these key leader engagements, we notice that there's about 8 individuals that get reported as we're starting to move into the operations of the event. 8 men are seen en masse heading east along the river. This is the first significant event as far as the enemy goes, where there's an attack that is later initiated with a vehicle-borne IED in vicinity of TRP-4. The Blue Max helicopter gets on station. They have about an hour and 30-minute station time with 38 rockets and 16 Hellfire rockets, as that's called up from the commander. Enemy indirect fire to the south side of the river is taken out by the attack helo, and then they get retasked by that unit commander to observe one enemy combatant in vicinity of Red 7, another friendly unit along the river. Red 7 ends up capturing that enemy hostile and maneuvering them back for questioning and interrogation. A field interrogation begins to pursue to no avail, and evidence is somewhat collected at a later time. Eventually, 4 Toyota pickups of Iraqi soldiers arrive to be integrated into the defense at the village. Key leader engagements begin to resume with the presence of Iraqi soldiers in addition to their interpreter, and then the mayor arrives to address concerns for the public health concerns within the town as well. 2 possible courses of action: not aiding in transition or empowering the local government is kind of like the contingency factor here. So 1, if they have success of backing the villagers and it's not an Iraqi-led movement, then they're taking power away from the locals and they're not building confidence in the Iraqi government itself. So if they give too much support coming from the United States to the Iraqis, that doesn't build confidence in that local populace to continue to support the operations within that village. The second option here is that we're not aiding in that transition of power, and ultimately we are trying to withdraw. Around 2009 we actually ended up doing so, but we're trying to withdraw and slowly give that power and authority back to the Iraqi government, while we're still also kind of acting like a S3 logistical support node for those individuals to conduct those operations. We established a small team using internal medics and supplies to render aid. That was one COA that was briefed within the village whenever we had the key leader engagement. And then the other option would be to essentially call to hire to request more resources so the troops can focus externally on the enemy threat and not internally to the village. Let that be an Iraqi problem while the U.S. forces deal with eliminating the threat, while the Iraqis stand up the clinic, the police force, and other things. So those are the 2 COAs that are kind of on the table at this point. Eventually, new intelligence updates finds that the mastermind behind the vehicle-borne IED is spread throughout multiple locations in the region. This traces back to the village, and around 04:05 in the morning, 4 men end up detaining and conducting a tactical site exploitation on the target building with the IED maker. New concerns that arise is that the enemy is going to come as a result of working with the Americans. More enemy is going to infill into that village once they no longer have those VIBDs essentially being broadcasted through the region. So that's going to raise some red flags to the enemy node where, hey, they're not receiving the support anymore, something's going on, and they're going to go to that point of origin and begin to inspect. And that's what the villagers have a lot of concerns with at this point in time. The Iraqi unit leader eventually takes the lead for a training of 3 police officers to remain locally in the village and 1 medic, in addition to the possibility of establishing a clinic in the town. But they have to get additional resources from the U.S. to support that because they do not have the organic material to just establish something out of thin air. Some external factors to consider is that the enemy's retaliation upon learning that the supplies for the IED is no longer there. They're going to retaliate and try to capture key players from the village. A medical and police force is not fully established yet, so there's no guarantee that it's going to be maintained once the Americans actually leave. Having that logistical support no longer physically present and having those lapses in supply lines and communication lines is going to cause severe delays, and by the time reinforcements or those supplies actually end up getting to that location, the enemy's always going to have a foothold back in there, more than likely. The Iraqi government will eventually turn its control over to the town people itself, and the locals will be the one to stand in police force and their own medic, their clinic, and that'll eventually be the transition, with that being the end goal in the long term. But like previously mentioned, that this is going to leave them vulnerable and susceptible to another counterattack. Government aid will eventually run out, whether it's from the U.S. or the Iraqis, and we're no longer there to supply medicine or ammunition to support these operations. Then they're going to have to find ways and means to do this internally. Some key actors. So we have Phil, which is going to be that unit leader. We have Muhammad as the interpreter. We have the mayor, the medic, locals in the village center, so-called outsiders as well, and Hire, who we have to coordinate with. The what? Winning the hearts and minds. At the end of the day, the goal was each day that there's fewer and fewer enemy and no creation of new ones by upsetting the locals. So that was the job and the overall goal that Phil had briefed his subordinates prior to, that this is what he wanted to have. This was his end state and his desire from day in and day out operations. Not to disrupt the public and create more enemies, but eliminate the actual threat and then create a new way of life forward for the village. Eventually, that there were these men that ended up coming in and infiltrating and disrupting the defense at the location. The 8 men in MISC, which were quickly rendered incapacitated with the addition of that one who tried to escape, ended up being captured by Red 7. At the end of the day, these individuals are key influences to the operations within the operating environment, because if they are not dealt with accordingly and they do not have the means to support themselves internally, then the external factors can be more of a hindrance than a learning point. Or, when they're going through these struggles, you would think that they would have some growth and they would be able to learn from their mistakes in the past, but they don't have a baseline to go off of. Once the Americans leave, that's going to leave them very vulnerable and open to attacks further on down the line. So some other external factors other than the United States is the overall counterinsurgency operations. Whenever there is a historic pattern going back to Afghanistan with the villagers and the farmers, this is a way of life for these locals. So if they're farming and they're doing certain things that just so happen to be coinciding with the drug trade or coinciding with a way of income, both for themselves but also for the terrorists of that time, then they're going to be more likely to be sympathizers with the enemy combatants. You saw this time and time again in Afghanistan, Helmand Province, saying in Afghanistan, where there's a multitude of farmers who, while the Americans are there, they're all for it, they're all about it, they want them to be there for the support. Where that begins to degrade is once those American forces leave and we're just leaving it to the Iraqis or the Afghanis, then that local government begins to slowly collapse without that external support, because then they fall victim to the re-infiltration of the Taliban or the Al-Qaeda or other terrorist networks and cells, and they would be more likely to sympathize and say, hey, if you give me a cut of this, I'll let you continue to do your job and we won't come after your family. Or you have less and less civilians or enemy who sympathize with the local populace. They say they can do it their own, and they just eradicate those villagers who worked with the U.S. forces. So we're kind of seeing that as a trend in current events now in Afghanistan as that transition has occurred. And they're just basically hunting down those individuals and those sympathizers with the U.S. as opposed to utilizing them moving forward, saying, hey, we know that you worked with the U.S. before. We know that you have some information and knowledge potentially about certain courses of actions, some TTPs and SOPs that they utilized. How about we gainfully employ you to do the job, but now for us and for our profit, while we're still providing you with security and a means or a way to live your life continuously in this village. So there's a lot of different factors that could have gone wrong with this defense. Specifically, if the enemy combatants would have been successful with that vehicle-borne IED, which I believe was the initiator for the attack at the village, if they would have been successful with that and they didn't go through the proper ROEs of, they hit that barrier checkpoint and the enemy was still coming and they eliminated that threat, that could have been a human error. They could have detonated it, which they luckily didn't. It was detonated by the response to that threat. Then a ripple effect could have occurred. And then with the addition of those 8 fighters quickly suppressed, I think we were really well positioned in this location to have a general idea and understanding of what the missions were, what the TTPs of the enemy were, and what exactly were the goals going forward. So having a clear commander's intent prior to going into any operation and having like a fingertip like sensory feel for the battlefield just provides that much more lethality and survivability to not only you, but the villagers and your counterparts once the Iraqis eventually came on station. So all in all, the defense was really well orchestrated, even though we didn't necessarily plan on going in with a full-on defense. It was more of the humanitarian or Block 1 style warfare. We ended up dabbling into the Block 2 and potentially some could argue Block 3. Although we weren't going and doing hard knocks from door to door in every village building, we still had some target areas which we wanted to go investigate. And eventually, once the consensus was we eliminated the big key threats, then we could start working on that transition and ensuring that the locals had that good stand-in force. They were all trained before we got retasked from higher. Although it was a quick turnaround, I think that the Iraqis did a solid job and that they were able to do their due diligence for those locals and ensure that they were going to be set up for success, ultimately winning the hearts and minds of the local populace before getting retasked and the Americans leaved. Thank you.